In the spring of 1907, workers broke ground beneath the Rockefeller estate in Pocantico Hills, New York. They were told they were digging drainage channels. They were told they were reinforcing the foundation. They were told a great many things. What they were never told was what they would find 60 feet below the surface. A chamber so old, so geometrically precise, and so deliberately sealed that the foreman reportedly refused to re-enter it after his first descent. 3 workers quit the same afternoon. One of them never spoke about what he saw, not to his wife, not to his priest, not to anyone. He took it to his grave in 1943, and the only record of his presence at that site was quietly removed from the estate's labour log sometime before 1911. What was down there? What was sealed beneath one of the most powerful family compounds in American history, buried under layers of soil that carbon analysis would later suggest had been undisturbed for at least 5 centuries before the Rockefellers ever arrived? And why, when researchers began pulling at that thread in the late 20th century, did every institutional door slam shut with the same coordinated silence? If you have been following this channel, you already know that the world you were taught to believe in is a replacement, a curated, managed substitute for something far older, far more sophisticated, and far more spiritually charged than the sanitized version of history handed to you in classrooms. You already know about Tartaria, you already know about the reset, but what you may not know is that certain families did not just inherit the world after the collapse, they inherited the knowledge of what was buried inside it, and they built their empires directly on top of those burial sites, on purpose, with full understanding of what lay beneath their feet. Subscribe now and turn on notifications. What is coming in this video is not speculation, it is a pattern, and once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. The Rockefeller name carries a particular gravity in the architecture of modern power. Standard Oil, the Federal Reserve, the United Nations complex, Rockefeller Center, built in the 1930s directly over anomalous subsurface formations that geologists at the time could not explain. The standard explanation for this accumulation of influence is ruthless capitalism, generational wealth, strategic philanthropy deployed as soft power. That explanation is not wrong. It is simply incomplete. The Rockefellers did not build their power from scratch. They built it on top of something. The estate at Pocantico Hills sits in the Hudson Valley, a corridor that has drawn the most powerful families in American history with a consistency scenery alone cannot explain. The Vanderbilts, the Astors, the Roosevelts, all clustering along the same river valley, on top of the same geological formation, adjacent to the same underground network that indigenous accounts describe as the dwelling place of the old ones. That is not a metaphor. And in 1907, something beneath the Rockefeller estate confirmed exactly what those accounts described. The excavation was authorized by John D. Rockefeller Sr. himself. He was 67 years old at the time, already the wealthiest man in recorded American history, already past the point where he needed anything the physical world could offer him materially. The work order was issued in February. By March, the teams had hit stone, not bedrock, stone, cut stone, dressed and fitted with a precision that no colonial-era construction technique could account for. The blocks were interlocked in a pattern that structural engineers today would recognize immediately. The same interlocking mortar-free masonry that appears in pre-Columbian Andean sites, in the oldest layers of Egyptian temple complexes, in the foundations beneath Ottoman-era structures across Central Asia. The same construction signature, the same builder, everywhere. What they found inside the chamber was documented in 3 separate private letters, 2 of which survived and are held in collections whose owners have declined to allow public access. The 3rd letter, written by the estate's chief engineer to his brother in Philadelphia, was sold at auction in 1987 and subsequently disappeared from the record. What the surviving fragments of these accounts describe is consistent and specific. The chamber was circular. Its walls were covered floor to ceiling in a script that no scholar consulted at the time could identify. Not Algonquin, not any known indigenous North American writing system, not Latin, not Hebrew, something older, something that predated the supposed arrival of writing in the Western Hemisphere by several thousand years, according to the archaeological consensus that existed even in 1907. At the centre of the chamber was a table, not a stone altar in the crude sense of the word. A table, flat-surfaced, waist-height, with channels carved into its surface that ran to collection points at its four corners. The channels were darkly stained. Whatever had flowed through them over centuries had seeped deep into the stone. Analysis was never conducted officially. Unofficially, one of the workers described the smell of the chamber as something between iron and rot, a smell that clung to his clothing for days, and that his wife described as making the air in their house feel wrong. He could not find a better word for it. Wrong. This is where the Tartarian context becomes essential. The civilization that academic history refuses to acknowledge was not simply a sophisticated material culture. It was a civilization organized around a specific spiritual framework, a cosmology, a set of ritual practices governing the relationship between the human world and something that surviving fragments across 3 continents describe as the current beneath everything. This was a force their priests. Every Tartarian city had a priestly class, identifiable by the placement of the largest domed structures, believed flowed through the earth through specific channels through specific sites. Those sites required maintenance. They required offerings, in the oldest and most literal sense. The chamber beneath Pocantico Hills was not a ruin. It was a functioning installation that had been in continuous ritual use before the reset severed the chain of initiated knowledge. And the Rockefellers knew this before they broke ground. How did they know? The networks that preserved Tartarian operational knowledge after the collapse were not external to the power structures of the modern world. They were the power structures. The initiatory traditions that fed into Freemasonry, into Rosicrucianism, into the financial bloodline networks that predate any national government, carried within them a specific technical inheritance, encoded in ritual, encoded in the geometric proportions of buildings that outer memberships constructed without understanding what those proportions were measuring. John D. Rockefeller Sr. was a Baptist. That was his public face. But the families that operate at that level of consolidated power have always maintained a distinction between the faith they present to the world and the knowledge they transmit within the bloodline. The Rothschilds, the Warburgs, the Morgans, every family that sat at the table where the architecture of the modern world was decided had behind its public identity a private initiatory practice understood as the real source of their continuity and power. What that practice was drawing on at its deepest level was the Tartarian inheritance. The knowledge of where the current ran beneath the earth, the knowledge of which sites amplified it, the knowledge of what the sites required to remain active. The chamber at Pocantico Hills was one of those sites, and in 1907 John D. Rockefeller Sr. had it carefully documented, had it photographed with equipment that was cutting edge for its time, had it physically secured, and had the entire excavation sealed and buried under a secondary concrete pour that no subsequent ground-penetrating survey has been able to fully map through. The workers who went into that chamber were selected carefully. Those who reacted badly were dismissed with payments generous enough to ensure silence, but small enough to carry the implicit threat. The ones who remained were incorporated into the estate's permanent staff under terms that included housing, healthcare, and pension arrangements, extraordinary for that era. You do not offer a labourer lifetime security in 1907 for digging drainage channels. You offer it for seeing something you must never describe. The script on the walls is the element that surfaces most consistently across the fragmented accounts. 3 different witnesses describe it the same way. Wall to wall, floor to ceiling. Dense, precise, systematic, not decorative, instructional. One witness, not an educated man, reached for the word recipe. People who have studied Tartarian architectural context recognize exactly what he was describing. The interior surfaces of Tartarian functional spaces were covered in operational text, procedures, sequences, a civilization that embedded its technical knowledge directly into the walls of the structures designed to perform that knowledge. What functions? In the context of a circular chamber with a central collection table and wall-to-wall instructional text, the answer is not ambiguous to anyone who has studied Tartarian priestly architecture. This was a site of transference, where what flowed through those channels was not symbolic but operational, where the people who used this space understood themselves to be maintaining something that would otherwise go dark. And that something in the Tartarian cosmological framework was not a neutral force. The civilization that built these sites did not worship in the way that word is commonly understood. They transacted. Their relationship with the force beneath the earth was contractual, technical, and exact. The contracts required payment in specific currencies with no equivalent in any sanitized religious tradition. What was smelled in that chamber in 1907? What had darkened those channels over centuries? That was the payment ledger. Every transaction conducted at that site, across however many generations before the collapse, buried it. The Rockefellers did not find an archaeological curiosity. They found a site that was still charged, still operational in some sense that 1907 science had no framework to describe, but that their inherited initiatory knowledge told them to treat with absolute seriousness. They sealed it in concrete, built their compound directly over it, oriented specific structures in relation to it, and ensured the location would remain known only within the chain of inheritance they controlled. Pocantico Hills remained the primary Rockefeller family seat for the entire 20th century. The Trilateral Commission held its early organizational meetings at the estate. The architecture of post-war global finance was discussed in rooms built over that sealed chamber. Whether the proximity to an active Tartarian ritual site conferred anything operational on the people working above it is a question this channel does not pretend to answer definitively. But the pattern it represents is not limited to Pocantico Hills. It is the pattern. Every centre of consolidated modern power sits on top of something old. The City of London sits on top of the oldest continuously inhabited ritual site in the British Isles. The Bank for International Settlements in Basel sits over a Roman-era temple complex whose full extent has never been publicly surveyed. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York sits 60 feet below street level in a chamber cut from Manhattan schist in the 1920s, and pre-construction surveys revealed subsurface anomalies described only as natural formations inconsistent with surrounding geology. That phrase appears in pre-construction surveys of the BIS in Basel, in geological assessments before Rockefeller Center was cleared for development, in soil reports from the Vatican Gardens, from Waddesdon, from Jekyll Island. The same bureaucratic language used to mark something that cannot be explained and must not be explained, under every throne, under every vault, under every room where the architecture of the world has been decided. The Tartarian civilization did not simply collapse, it was dismantled. Its knowledge was extracted by the initiatory networks that had always formed its inner layer and that survived the reset by design, because the reset was in part their work. What they carried forward, encoded in the ritual architectures of their successor traditions, was the map. The map of where the sites were, what they required, how to maintain the current that their civilization had always understood as the actual source of durable power. The Rockefeller family has that map. They demonstrated it in 1907 when they found what they found and knew immediately what to do with it. They did not call a university. They did not call a museum. They called no one. They sealed it, secured it, built over it, and continued the transactions that the people who built that chamber had been conducting for centuries before anyone now alive drew their first breath. What was found under the Rockefeller mansion in 1907 was not a discovery. It was a reunion. A bloodline returning to the site its initiatory inheritance had always known it was there, confirming what the encoded knowledge told them to expect, and resuming the obligations that come with that knowledge in the only terms that sight has ever understood. The workers who went down that ladder and smelled what they smelled and saw what they saw had no framework for what they were standing inside. The man who owned the estate did. He had always had it. And every person who has sat in those rooms above that sealed chamber since then, every decision made in proximity to what lies 60 feet below the manicured grounds of Pocantico Hills, has been made in full awareness of what the foundation actually is. Not stone, not bedrock, something far older, something that does not sleep, something that the most powerful family in American history chose to build their entire legacy on top of, not despite what it is, but because of it. The history, you were taught, ends at the surface. The history that matters has always been underground.